The waitress overheard the Arab businessman plotting at the next table and secretly warned the billionaire just in time, saving him $50 million. Kimberly Chen had been invisible her entire life, not in the way that hurt, though sometimes it did, but in the way that made her useful. At 26 years old, she had mastered the art of blending into the background, of being present without being noticed, of hearing everything while appearing to hear nothing. It was 7:43 p.m. on a Tuesday evening at La Maison Rouge, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, where the cheapest entree cost $127 and a bottle of wine could run $3,400. Kimberly had worked there for 19 months, earning $4. 85 an hour plus tips that averaged $840 a week, enough to cover her $1,650 rent for a 340-square-foot studio in Queens and chip away at the $31,000 in medical debt she'd inherited when her father died. She moved between tables with practiced grace, her black uniform pristine, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. To the wealthy patrons who dined here, she was furniture, pleasant, efficient, forgettable. And that was exactly how she wanted it. But tonight, something was different. At table 14, 3 Arab businessmen had been speaking in hushed tones for the past 47 minutes. They'd ordered the tasting menu, $495 per person, and barely touched their food. Their words floated across the ambient noise, and Kimberly felt her heart rate quicken as she understood every syllable. To understand why a 26-year-old waitress in Manhattan spoke fluent Arabic, you had to go back 18 years, to a cramped apartment in Brooklyn, where an 8-year-old girl sat cross-legged on a faded carpet, her grandfather's weathered hands guiding hers across pages of Arabic script. Hassan Chen, her mother's father, had emigrated from Lebanon in 1962 with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. He'd built a small import business, married an Irish-American woman who thought his accent was charming, and raised a daughter who would later marry a Chinese accountant named David Chen. When their granddaughter was born, Hassan made a promise. He would teach her his language, his culture, his stories. "Arabic is not just words, Habibti," he would say, his voice rich with the accent he never lost. "It is history. It is poetry. It is the sound of a people who have survived everything. For 10 years, every Sunday afternoon belonged to them." He taught her classical Arabic, the Lebanese dialect, the Egyptian dialect. He taught her to read the Quran for its literary beauty, to recite poetry by Mahmoud Darwish, to understand the subtle differences in meaning that a single vowel could create. When Kimberly was 16, Hassan had a stroke. He spent his final 3 weeks in a hospital bed, unable to speak, but his eyes would light up when she would sit beside him and recite the poems he'd taught her. She held his hand when he died, whispering the words of his favorite verse. "We have on this earth what makes life worth living." He left her $4,200 in a savings account, a collection of handwritten recipe cards, and a language that lived inside her like a secret garden. Now, 8 years later, that secret garden was about to save a stranger's life. "The American doesn't suspect anything," one of the men at table 14 was saying. "He thinks this is a legitimate investment opportunity." Kimberly refilled water glasses at a nearby table, her hands steady even as her pulse raced. $50 million, another man replied. "Once he signs the documents tomorrow, the money transfers to the offshore account. By the time his lawyers realize what happened, we'll be gone. And the property rights in Dubai? Worthless. The permits were never approved. The whole development exists only on paper." Kimberly's stomach turned. She thought of her father, who had trusted a business partner and lost everything: his savings, his health, his will to live. David Chen had died of a heart attack at 53, 6 months after discovering that the man he'd considered a friend had embezzled $180,000 from their small accounting firm. The stress had killed him as surely as any bullet. She would not let another person suffer the same fate, not if she could help it. The problem was figuring out who the target was. The men hadn't mentioned a name, only the American. But La Maison Rouge was full of wealthy Americans on any given night. She needed more information. At 8:17 p.m., the door opened and everything changed. He walked in like he owned the place, which Kimberly would later learn he technically did. 34 years old, Tall, dark hair with threads of premature gray at the temples, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her annual rent. His face was handsome in a severe way, all sharp angles and guarded eyes, the face of someone who had learned early that the world would take everything if you let it. But what struck Kimberly wasn't his looks or his obvious wealth. It was the way the three men at table 14 straightened in their seats, suddenly alert, suddenly hungry, like predators spotting prey. "Mr. Mercer," the maitre d' said, practically glowing, "your usual table is ready, and your guests are already here." He nodded once, a gesture so economical it barely qualified as movement, and made his way toward table 14. Marcus Mercer. Kimberly had seen his name in Forbes, on the cover of Business Insider, in the society pages of the New York Times. CEO of Mercer Global Investments, net worth estimated at $890 million, known for his ruthless business acumen and his complete lack of personal life. The tabloids called him the Ice King of Wall Street. His employees called him worse, and in approximately 12 hours, if she did nothing, he was about to lose $50 million to a fraudulent real estate scheme. Kimberly watched him shake hands with the three men, his expression pleasant but unreadable. He had no idea. How could he? He didn't speak Arabic. He didn't know that the smiles across from him were masks, that the handshakes were knives waiting to be drawn. She had maybe 2 hours before he left. 2 hours to figure out how to warn a billionaire, who had no reason to listen to a waitress, that his business partners were planning to rob him blind. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "The truth, Habibti, is like water. It will always find a way through." At 8:34 p.m., she approached the table with the wine list, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Good evening, Mr. Mercer. May I tell you about our special selections tonight?" He barely glanced at her. The 2015 Chateau Margaux, 4 glasses. Of course. She hesitated, knowing she had seconds before the moment would seem strange. "And if you need anything at all tonight, anything, please don't hesitate to ask for me. My name is Kimberly." Something flickered in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or suspicion. "Thank you." As she walked away, she caught a snippet of the conversation behind her, the men switching to Arabic, confident in their privacy. "She's pretty," one of them remarked. "Perhaps after we close the deal, we can celebrate properly." "Focus," another snapped. "We need the signatures first. Everything else can wait." Kimberly's jaw tightened. She had less time than she thought. For the next hour, she worked on autopilot, refilling glasses, delivering plates, smiling the smile she'd perfected over 19 months of serving people who looked through her. But her mind was racing, calculating, planning. She couldn't simply walk up to Marcus Mercer and tell him his business partners were criminals. He would never believe her. Why would he? She was nobody. A waitress with a GED and a talent for languages, nothing more. He would assume she was crazy, or worse, that she was part of some elaborate scheme herself. No, she needed to show him the truth without revealing how she knew it. At 9:47 p.m., opportunity arrived in the form of a spilled drink. Not an accident. She'd perfected the art of controlled spills during her first month on the job, a technique for dealing with handsy customers. Tonight she used it for a different purpose. "Oh, I'm so sorry." She dabbed at the tablecloth with a napkin, leaning close to Marcus Mercer as she cleaned up the minimal mess. "Please let me." In one smooth motion, she slipped a folded napkin into his jacket pocket. On it, she had written in careful block letters, "The men you're with are planning to defraud you. The Dubai development is fake. The permits don't exist. Do not sign anything tomorrow. Verify everything yourself." She didn't look at him, didn't wait for a reaction, just apologized again, offered to comp their desserts, and walked away. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of anxiety. She watched from across the room as Marcus excused himself to use the restroom, and returned with a different look in his eyes. Harder, colder, the look of a man who had just discovered a snake in his garden. When the bill came, $2,147 before tip, he paid without blinking. The three men laughed and clapped him on the back, promising great things to come, riches beyond imagination. Marcus smiled and nodded and said all the right things. But Kimberly saw his hands, the way they gripped the pen just a little too tightly, the way his jaw clenched whenever they spoke. He believed her. Somehow, impossibly, he believed her. At 11:23 p.m., after the restaurant had closed and she'd finished side work, rolling silverware, wiping down tables, counting out her cash tips, $127 from the night, less than usual, she stepped out into the cold November air. Her feet ached from 9 hours in cheap heels. Her back hurt from carrying trays. Her mind was still spinning from what she'd done. She had helped a stranger who would never know her name, never understand what she'd risked. And that was fine. That was the way her grandfather had lived, doing good without seeking credit, trusting that the universe kept its own accounts. She was halfway to the subway when a black Mercedes pulled up beside her. The window rolled down and Marcus Mercer's face appeared in the darkness. "Get in," he said. "We need to talk." Kimberly's first instinct was to run. Her second was to laugh. Her third, the one she actually followed, was to square her shoulders and meet his gaze. "You could start with please," she said. Something that might have been surprise flickered across his face. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth twitched. "Please," he said, "get in the car so I can thank the woman who just saved me $50 million. She got in. And before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your city in the comments below, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe for more. Now let's see what happens next." The interior of the Mercedes smelled like leather and sandalwood, a scent that probably cost more than Kimberly's entire bathroom cabinet of products from the dollar store. She sat as far from Marcus Mercer as the backseat allowed, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight. He was watching her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, not in a threatening way, but in the way of someone trying to solve a puzzle they'd never encountered before. "How did you know?" he asked finally. His voice was different now, away from the restaurant. Rougher, more human. "I speak Arabic," she said simply. I understood what they were saying. "You speak Arabic." It wasn't a question. "Fluently. Also some Hebrew, and I'm learning Farsi. Languages are," she hesitated, "a hobby." Marcus leaned back against the leather seat, his expression unreadable. "A waitress who speaks Arabic, Hebrew, and is learning Farsi. Who works at a restaurant where she can barely afford the appetizers. Who risks her job, possibly her safety, to warn a complete stranger about a $50 million fraud. When you put it like that, I do sound a little insane. Or incredibly brave." He studied her. "Why?" The question hung in the air between them. Kimberly could have given him a dozen answers, because it was the right thing to do, because she hated injustice, because her grandfather had raised her to believe that good deeds mattered. But the truth was simpler and more painful than any of that. "My father," she said quietly. "He was cheated by someone he trusted. A business partner. They'd worked together for 11 years. And when David Chen finally discovered the embezzlement, $180,000, everything we had, the stress destroyed him. Heart attack. 53 years old." She looked out the window at the city lights blurring past. "I was 18. I watched my father die because he believed in the wrong person." Silence filled the car. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he meant it. Not the polite condolence that people offered without thought, but genuine understanding, recognition. "It was 8 years ago," Kimberly said. "I've made peace with it." "Have you?" She turned to look at him, surprised by the question. No one had ever asked her that before. Everyone assumed that time healed, that moving forward meant moving past. "Some days," she admitted. "Other days, I still hear the phone ringing at 3 a.m., still see my mother's face when the doctor said there was nothing they could do." Marcus nodded slowly. His jaw had tightened, and she noticed for the first time the shadows under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. This was not a man who slept well. "My grandfather," he said suddenly, the words seeming to escape against his will. "He died 3 years ago. Lung cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to..." He stopped, his throat working. He was the only person who ever believed in me. Kimberly waited. In her experience, silence was sometimes the greatest kindness you could offer someone in pain. I was born with nothing, Marcus continued, his voice low. My mother was 17 when she had me. Never knew my father. We lived in a trailer park in West Virginia until I was 12, surviving on food stamps and whatever jobs she could find. And then one day, out of nowhere, this old man showed up. Edward Mercer. Turns out he'd been looking for his daughter for 20 years. My grandmother had run away when she was 16 and he'd never stopped searching. He paused, lost in memory. He took us in, paid for my education, taught me everything I know about business, about life, about being a man. He used to say that money wasn't wealth, knowledge was wealth. Connections were wealth, character was wealth, the dollars were just a tool. He sounds like a wise man, Kimberly said softly. He was the best man I ever knew. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. And I wasn't there when he died. I was in Tokyo, closing a deal worth $340 million. A deal that didn't even matter. By the time I landed, he was gone. I never got to say goodbye. Never got to tell him that everything I am, everything I've built, it was all because of him. The confession hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. This was not the Ice King that the tabloids wrote about. This was a man carrying a grief so heavy it had reshaped him, turned him into someone who worked 18-hour days and kept everyone at arm's length because getting close meant losing. And losing meant the unbearable weight of everything he hadn't said. He knew, Kimberly said gently. He had to have known. Did he? Marcus turned to look at her, and for a moment the armor was completely gone. He was just a man, haunted by the same regrets that haunted everyone who had ever loved someone and lost them too soon. I used to call him every Sunday, every single Sunday for 15 years. And the last month of his life I was so busy that I only called twice. Twice. Because I thought there would be more time. There's never more time. Kimberly thought of her grandfather Hassan, of the Sunday afternoons that had shaped her entire life. She thought of holding his hand as he died, of reciting poetry through her tears. My grandfather taught me Arabic, she said, for 10 years every Sunday, and when he had his stroke, I was in the middle of finals. AP Chemistry. I almost didn't go to the hospital that first night because I was studying for a test that I can't even remember now, but something told me to go. Something told me it mattered more than any grade. And you went. I went. I held his hand for 3 weeks, read to him, talked to him. When he died, I was reciting his favorite poem. Her voice trembled. I was 18, and I didn't know anything about life. But I knew that I would regret forever if I didn't say goodbye. Marcus was staring at her like she'd just handed him something precious and terrifying. You were braver than me, he said. I was just lucky, she replied. Luck and timing and the fact that I trusted my instincts, that's all. The car slowed, and Kimberly realized they'd been driving in circles around the city. The digital clock on the dashboard read 12:17 a.m. She should be exhausted. She was exhausted, but something about this conversation had energized her, made her feel more alive than she had in months. I want to give you something, Marcus said. A reward for what you did tonight. No. The word came out sharper than she intended. Marcus blinked, clearly unaccustomed to refusal. I didn't do it for money, Kimberly continued more gently. I did it because it was right. If you want to thank me, donate to a charity. The Brooklyn Public Library could use the funding, or the hospital where my grandfather died. They're always short on everything. You're serious. Mr. Mercer, I make $4.85 an hour plus tips. I have $31,000 in medical debt and a studio apartment the size of your car. I'm not going to pretend that money wouldn't change my life. But if I take a reward for doing the right thing, then it wasn't really the right thing anymore, was it? It was just a transaction. He was looking at her like she was a species he'd never encountered, like everything he'd believed about people was being quietly dismantled. You're extraordinary, he said, and it wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact, delivered with something like wonder. I'm just someone who got lucky enough to learn a language that turned out to be useful at the right moment. She reached for the door handle. This is close enough to the subway. I can walk from here. It's after midnight in Manhattan. Let me drive you home. I've been taking the subway at midnight since I was 17. I'll be fine. Please. The word seemed to cost him something. Let me do at least this. Kimberly hesitated. Everything in her said she should leave, should walk away from this strange night and return to her ordinary life. But there was something in his eyes, a loneliness that mirrored her own, a hunger for connection that she recognized because she felt it every single day. Fine, she said. Queens, Jackson Heights. The drive took 43 minutes in late-night traffic. They talked the whole way, about his grandfather's lessons, about her father's death, about the way grief changes you into someone you barely recognize. He told her about his mother, who now lived in a mansion in Connecticut and still couldn't believe the life her son had built. She told him about her mother, who worked 2 jobs as a nurse's aide and had never once complained about the hand life dealt her. By the time the car pulled up to her building, a 6-story walk-up with a broken buzzer and a mailbox that hadn't locked properly in 3 years, Kimberly felt like she'd known Marcus Mercer her entire life. Thank you, she said, reaching for the door. For the ride. And for listening. Thank you, he replied. For everything. She was halfway out of the car when he spoke again. Would you? He stopped, something like nervousness flickering across his face. The billionaire CEO nervous. Would you have dinner with me? Not as a reward, just dinner. I'd like to see you again. Kimberly should have said no. Every practical bone in her body knew that this was a fairy tale that couldn't end well, that men like Marcus Mercer didn't date women like her, that the gap between their worlds was too vast to bridge. But her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. Fortune favors the brave, Habibti. Okay, she said, but I'm picking the restaurant. His smile, when it came, transformed his entire face. I would expect nothing less. She gave him her number, scrawled on the back of a receipt from her tips, and walked into her building. It wasn't until she was climbing the 4 flights to her apartment that she realized she was smiling too. And for the first time in 8 years, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, life was about to surprise her. She picked the restaurant 3 days later. Not out of strategy, but necessity. Her shifts at La Maison Rouge were Wednesday through Sunday, and she refused to call in sick for a date, even one with a billionaire. The place she chose was called Mama Zainab's, a Lebanese restaurant in Bay Ridge that Hassan used to take her to when she was a child. It was a 47-minute subway ride from Manhattan. The tablecloths were plastic, and the most expensive dish on the menu was the lamb platter at $23.95. If Marcus Mercer couldn't handle it, then she needed to know now, before she made the mistake of caring about him. He arrived at 7:15 p.m. in jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost $800, looking so conspicuously out of place that the elderly Lebanese woman behind the counter immediately pegged him as either lost or looking for drugs. I'm meeting someone, he said, and his eyes found Kimberly at a corner table. Something in his face softened. She'd worn her best dress, a navy blue wrap dress she'd found at a thrift store for $14 3 years ago. Her hair was down for once, falling past her shoulders in dark waves. She'd put on makeup, something she almost never did, and spent an embarrassing amount of time worrying about whether she looked like she was trying too hard. You found it, she said as he slid into the seat across from her. Your directions were very precise. Take the R train to 77th Street, walk 3 blocks east, turn left at the store with the evil eye in the window. He smiled slightly. The evil eye was a helpful landmark. It's for protection, against jealousy and bad intentions. Does it work? My grandmother believed it did. That's good enough for me. A waiter appeared, young, Lebanese, with the kind of easy smile that came from working at a family restaurant his entire life. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Marcus, clearly recognizing him from somewhere, but he said nothing. You're new here, he said instead, nodding at Marcus. Kim usually comes alone. or with her mom. "Ali, this is Marcus. Marcus, Ali. His grandmother owns this place. And she will be very curious about you," Ali said cheerfully. "She notices everything. Also, she will try to feed you until you can't move. It's a Lebanese grandmother thing." "I've been warned," Marcus said, and Kimberly was surprised by the genuine warmth in his voice. This was not the Ice King of Wall Street. This was someone else entirely. They ordered mezza to share, grilled lamb, tabbouleh salad, and as they waited for the food, Kimberly found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't expected. There was something about being on her own territory that changed the dynamic between them. Here she wasn't the waitress and he wasn't the billionaire. They were just two people, sharing hummus and stories. "Tell me about him," Marcus said. "Your grandfather, the one who taught you Arabic." Kimberly smiled, the memories washing over her like warm water. "Hassan Chen, though technically he was Hassan al-Mahmoud until he married my grandmother. She was Mary O'Brien, from a very Irish Catholic family in Boston. They met at a dance in 1964. She was 20, he was 23. He asked her to dance, and she said yes because she thought his accent was charming. She paused, her eyes growing distant. They were married for 48 years. When she died, he didn't last long, said the world was too quiet without her laughter. "That's beautiful," Marcus said quietly. "And devastating." That was their whole relationship. Beautiful and devastating, all wrapped up together. She took a sip of her mint tea. "He started teaching me Arabic when I was 8, every Sunday for 10 years. We'd sit in his apartment. He had this rug, this beautiful Persian rug that he'd brought from Lebanon, faded and worn but still the most precious thing he owned, and we'd read together. He started with the alphabet, then words, then sentences. By the time I was 14, we were reading poetry. Mahmoud Darwish, Nizar Qabbani, the great Arab poets. And you just absorbed all of it?" "I had a gift for languages. My brain is wired that way, I guess, but it was more than that." She looked at him, trying to explain something she'd never fully articulated before. "When I was speaking Arabic with him, I wasn't just learning words, I was learning a whole different way of seeing the world. Arabic has 50 words for love, did you know that? Each one means something slightly different. Ishq is the kind of love that blinds you. Hayam is the love that makes you wander, lost in someone else. Garam is the love that consumes you. Which one do you believe in?" The question caught her off guard. I don't know if I believe in any of them. Not for myself anyway. Love has always been something that happens to other people." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather used to say that love was like compound interest. Small investments made consistently over time eventually become something enormous, something you can't imagine living without. Smart man. The smartest. He also used to say that most people are too impatient for the good things in life. They want immediate returns, immediate gratification. But the best investments, in business, in relationships, in anything, take time." Their food arrived, plate after plate of fragrant dishes that made Marcus's eyes widen. Hummus and baba ganoush and fattoush salad. Grilled lamb so tender it fell apart at the touch of a fork. Rice with pine nuts and spiced meat. And finally, a plate of baklava that Mama Zainab sent out personally. For the new friend. They ate until they couldn't move, just as Ali had predicted. "I need to know something," Marcus said finally, pushing back from the table. "About that night, at the restaurant." Kimberly tensed. "What about it?" "How did you know I would believe you? The napkin, the warning, you took an enormous risk. What if I'd thought you were part of the scam? What if I'd had you arrested?" She considered the question. It was one she'd asked herself in the days since that night, lying awake in her tiny apartment, replaying every moment. "I didn't know," she admitted. "Not for sure. But I'd been watching you all evening. The way you sat, the way you listened, you weren't arrogant. Most of the people who come into that restaurant treat the staff like furniture. They don't see us. But you." She hesitated. "You thanked me when I refilled your water. You made eye contact. You noticed that I existed. And I thought, someone who notices a waitress is someone who might notice the truth. That's a lot of trust to place in a glass of water. My grandfather used to say that you can learn everything about a person by how they treat people who can do nothing for them. Waiters, janitors, taxi drivers, the people who are invisible to most of the world. She met his eyes. You weren't like the others. I took a chance. Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. The gesture was unexpected, almost tentative. This man who negotiated billion-dollar deals, uncertain about touching a waitress's fingers. The Arab businessmen were arrested yesterday, he said. My lawyers found evidence of 12 other fraud schemes spanning 5 years and 4 continents. Estimated total losses they've caused, $340 million, and it all unraveled because of a napkin. Kimberly felt something loosen in her chest. I'm glad. You saved me, Kimberly. Not just the money, though $50 million is certainly significant, but you saved me from trusting the wrong people again. I've spent 3 years since my grandfather died, convinced that the world was full of people trying to take advantage. And then you came along and proved that there were still people who do good things just because they're right. I'm not that special, she said, but her voice wobbled slightly. You are, he said. You absolutely are. And I'm going to spend however long it takes proving that to you. She wanted to argue, wanted to protect herself from the hope that was blooming in her chest like something dangerous and beautiful. But his hand was warm in hers, and his eyes held no pretense, no agenda, just genuine connection, the kind she hadn't felt since before her father died. I should warn you, she said. I'm a terrible investment. I have medical debt. I work 60 hours a week. My apartment has mice and a radiator that sounds like someone's murdering a cat every night. I'm not the kind of person who fits into your world. My world, Marcus said slowly, is very lonely. I have a penthouse that costs $2 million, and I've slept there maybe 200 nights in 3 years. I have 11,000 employees and not a single person I'd call a friend. I have more money than I could spend in 5 lifetimes, and most days I'd trade all of it for one more Sunday phone call with my grandfather. He squeezed her fingers. You're not a terrible investment, Kimberly. You're exactly the kind of investment my grandfather taught me to look for. Undervalued by everyone else. Full of potential that most people are too blind to see. The kind of thing that seems small now, but will change everything if you just have the patience to let it grow. She should have been terrified. This was too fast, too intense, too much like the fairy tales she'd stopped believing in at 18. But when she looked at him, really looked, past the expensive clothes and the famous name, all she saw was a man who understood loss the same way she did. A man who carried grief like a second heartbeat. A man who, for all his billions, was just as alone as she was. One date at a time, she said finally. That's all I can promise. One date at a time, and we'll see where it goes. I can work with that, he said, and his smile was the most genuine thing she'd seen in years. They split a second helping of baklava. Mama Zainab came out personally to meet Kimberly's young man, and spent 15 minutes telling stories about Hassan, who used to bring his granddaughter here every month until he couldn't leave the house anymore. By the time they left, it was nearly 11 p.m., and the street was quiet and cold and full of stars you couldn't see in Manhattan. I had a wonderful time, Kimberly said as they walked toward the subway. So did I. Marcus paused. Can I see you again? Soon? My next day off is Thursday. Thursday it is. He hesitated, then leaned down and kissed her cheek, gentle, almost reverent. Good night, Kimberly Chen. Good night, Marcus Mercer. She watched him walk away, toward the black car that had been waiting 3 blocks over, discreet but present, and felt something flutter in her chest. Hope. Fear. The dangerous combination of both. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. Love, Habibti, is never safe. That is what makes it beautiful. She turned toward the subway, smiling despite herself, and didn't see Marcus watching from the car window until she disappeared underground. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Kimberly's life. She still worked her shifts at La Maison Rouge, Still earned her $4. 85 an hour plus tips. Still came home with aching feet and stories about difficult customers. Still fell asleep in her tiny apartment with the radiator screaming. But now, woven through the ordinary, was something extraordinary. Marcus took her to his grandfather's favorite places, a hole-in-the-wall diner in the Bronx where Edward Mercer used to take him for breakfast every Saturday, a park bench in Central Park where they would sit and talk for hours about business, about life, about what it meant to be a man, a bookstore in the village that had been there since 1952, where Edward bought his first book about investing for $2. $50, and changed both their lives. He would have loved you, Marcus said one evening, standing in front of that bookstore. He always said the best people were the ones who didn't need money to know their own worth. In return, Kimberly showed him her New York, the bodega on the corner of her street where Mr. Ramirez had given her free sandwiches during the worst months after her father died, the library branch where she'd spent countless hours as a teenager, teaching herself Hebrew from borrowed books, the spot on the Brooklyn Bridge where her grandfather had first taught her to recite poetry in public, shouting Arabic verses into the wind while tourists stared. "This was our secret," she said. Hassan said that poetry was meant to be heard by the sky, not just read on a page. "Recite something for me." She hesitated. It felt too intimate, too revealing, more vulnerable than anything they'd shared so far. But Marcus was looking at her with such openness, such genuine curiosity, that she couldn't refuse. She closed her eyes and let the words flow. "We have on this earth what makes life worth living. April's hesitation, the aroma of bread at dawn, a woman's point of view about men, the works of Aeschylus, the beginning of love, grass on a stone, mothers living on a flute's sigh and the invader's fear of memories." When she opened her eyes, Marcus was staring at her like she'd just handed him the moon. "That was beautiful," he said quietly. "Mahmoud Darwish, my grandfather's favorite poet. He was Palestinian, wrote about exile and longing, and what it means to love a home you can never return to." She looked out at the city lights. "I never understood it fully until he died. Now I recite it and I feel like I'm home just for a moment." Marcus stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I haven't felt at home anywhere since my grandfather passed," he said. "His house is still exactly the way he left it. I pay a full-time staff to maintain it, but I've only been there once since the funeral. I couldn't handle it." "That makes sense. Does it? Everyone else tells me I should sell it. Move on. It's been 3 years. The property is worth $4 million just sitting there, appreciating. But every time I think about putting it on the market, I see his face. I hear his voice. I imagine some stranger walking through his library, touching his books, erasing every trace of him." Kimberly reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold, despite the mild October weather. "You're not ready," she said simply, "and there's no timeline for grief. Anyone who tells you otherwise has never really lost someone." He looked at her, his expression raw. "How did you get so wise?" "I lost someone too. And I spent a long time pretending I was fine when I wasn't. It doesn't work." They stood there on the bridge, the city sprawling around them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Marcus leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't like the kiss on her cheek after their first date. Careful, restrained, almost polite. This was something else entirely. This was need and longing and 3 years of walls finally crumbling. This was two people who understood loss finding something to hold on to. When they finally pulled apart, Kimberly's heart was racing and her hands were trembling, and every rational thought had fled her mind. "I'm falling for you," Marcus said, his forehead resting against hers. "I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other, but I can't stop thinking about you. When I'm in meetings, when I'm reviewing contracts, when I should be focused on the 100 things that demand my attention every day, all I can think about is when I'll see you again." That's a lot," she managed. "I know, and I know this is probably terrifying for you. It's terrifying for me too. I've spent 3 years convincing myself that I was better off alone, that caring about people only led to pain. And then you walked into my life with a napkin and a warning and completely destroyed everything I thought I knew. Kimberly laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. You make it sound so romantic, wasn't it? In a strange, terrifying, life-altering way. She thought about it, the adrenaline of that night, the risk she'd taken, the moment she'd slipped the napkin into his pocket and known that nothing would ever be the same. Yes, she admitted. I suppose it was. The next few weeks were a blur of stolen moments. Marcus would show up at her apartment after her shifts, sometimes at midnight, sometimes later, with takeout from restaurants that probably didn't even offer takeout to normal people. They would sit on her floor, her only chair was broken, and eat and talk until the sun came up. He learned her rhythms, the way she hummed to herself when she was nervous, the way she organized her tips by denomination before counting them, the way she kept a photo of her father in her wallet, worn soft from being touched so many times. She learned his. The way he checked his phone compulsively even when he didn't want to, the way he ran his hand through his hair when he was stressed, the way he carried a brass compass in his pocket, a gift from his grandfather on his 16th birthday, engraved with the words, "Always know where you're going, but never forget where you came from." He gave me this the day he officially adopted me, Marcus said, turning the compass over in his hands. I was 12. I didn't even know that was a thing, that someone could just choose you. But he sat me down and said, "Marcus, I've been looking for my family my whole life, and I finally found you." And then he gave me his name, his legacy, his future. That's incredible. It was the first time anyone had ever chosen me for something that mattered. My father chose to leave. My mother's boyfriends chose to ignore me. The kids at school chose to mock the poor kid from the trailer park. But Edward chose me, and that choice changed everything. Kimberly understood. Her grandfather had chosen her too in his own way, had chosen to share his language, his culture, his heart, had chosen to invest countless hours in a child who wasn't his by blood, but was his in every way that mattered. The people who choose us, she said softly, they're the real family. Not blood, not obligation, just love, freely given. Marcus kissed her then, and she felt herself falling into something that had no bottom and no safety net. But every fairy tale has its complication. It came on a Thursday evening, exactly 7 weeks after the night with the napkin. Kimberly was finishing her shift at La Maison Rouge, counting out her tips, 163 is a good night, when her manager Derek appeared at her elbow. "There's someone here to see you," he said, his expression strange. She looked up, expecting Marcus. Instead, she saw a woman. Mid-50s, impeccably dressed in a gray Chanel suit that cost more than Kimberly made in a year. Silver hair swept back in an elegant chignon. Eyes like Marcus's, dark, intense, assessing, but without any of his warmth. "You must be the waitress," the woman said, and her voice made the words sound like an insult. "Mom," Marcus appeared behind her, his face tense. "I asked you to wait in the car. And I decided that I needed to see for myself the woman who has apparently captivated my son." The woman's eyes swept over Kimberly, taking in the cheap uniform, the sensible shoes, the tip still clutched in her hand. "Interesting choice. I'm going to ask you to leave," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. "I drove 2 hours from Connecticut to talk some sense into you. The least you can do is let me say my piece." Kimberly watched the exchange with a sinking feeling. She knew what this was. Had seen it play out 1,000 times in movies and books and the stories of friends who dated above their station. The rich mother, the unsuitable girlfriend, the inevitable confrontation. She just hoped it wouldn't happen to her. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, keeping her voice calm. "I'm happy to have a conversation with you, but perhaps not in my workplace in front of my colleagues." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. Surprised, perhaps, that the waitress could string together a coherent sentence. "Fine. The car, then. Marcus, you can join us or not." "I'm joining," he said grimly. The Blacktown car was parked outside, engine running. Kimberly slid into the back seat, Marcus beside her, his mother across from them both. The partition was up, the driver invisible. "I'll be direct," Mrs. Mercer said. "I've had you investigated, Miss Chen. Your father was an accountant who died penniless after his partner stole everything. Your mother is a nurse's aide who works 2 jobs. You have $31,000 in medical debt, no college degree, and no prospects beyond serving food to wealthy strangers. Does that summary accurately capture your situation?" "It does," Kimberly said evenly. "Though you left out the part about my grandfather teaching me Arabic, which is how I met your son, and the part about saving him $50 million, but other than that, yes. Accurate." Something flickered in the woman's eyes. Surprise? Respect? It was gone before Kimberly could identify it. "You're clever," Mrs. Mercer said. "I'll give you that, but clever isn't enough. My son is heir to a $890 million fortune. He will be scrutinized by the press, by investors, by everyone who wants a piece of that pie. And when they scrutinize him, they will scrutinize whoever is standing beside him. Can you handle that? The paparazzi? The gossip columns? The society wives who will smile to your face and destroy you behind your back?" "Mom," Marcus said, his voice tight, "this is completely inappropriate. This is reality, something you seem to have forgotten." She turned back to Kimberly. "I'm not trying to be cruel, Miss Chen. I'm trying to protect my son from making a mistake that will haunt him for the rest of his life. You seem like a nice girl. Genuinely, you do. But nice isn't enough in our world. In our world, you need money, connections, the right background, and you have none of those things." Kimberly felt the words land like blows, not because they were cruel, she'd expected cruelty, but because they were true. She didn't have money, she didn't have connections, she didn't have the right background, but she also had something that money couldn't buy. "You're right," she said. "I don't have any of those things, and I probably never will. But I do have something that seems to be in short supply in your world, Mrs. Mercer. I have integrity. I have loyalty. I have the ability to do the right thing even when it costs me something." She looked at Marcus, then back at his mother. "Your son was about to be defrauded out of $50 million. I could have said nothing. I could have kept my head down, earned my tips, gone home to my tiny apartment and minded my own business. But I didn't. I risked my job, maybe my safety, to warn a stranger because it was right. And I would do it again 1,000 times because that's who I am." The car was silent. "I don't care about his money," Kimberly continued. "I didn't even know who he was when I warned him. I just saw a man who was about to be hurt by people he trusted, and I couldn't let that happen. So you can investigate me all you want. You can dig through every detail of my life, but you won't find anything except exactly what you've already found. A woman who works hard, pays her debts, and tries to do good in the world." She reached for the door handle. "Kimberly, wait," Marcus started. "I think I should go home," she said quietly. "You and your mother have things to discuss. I'll call you tomorrow." She stepped out of the car before he could stop her and walked away into the night. She didn't call him the next day. She didn't call him the day after that either. It wasn't anger, though she had plenty of that. It was something deeper, something that had been quietly growing since the moment she'd slipped that napkin into his pocket. Fear. Not of his mother, or the press, or the society wives who would judge her. Fear of herself. Because Mrs. Mercer wasn't wrong. Kimberly lay in her tiny apartment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of Africa, and forced herself to face the truth. She was falling in love with Marcus Mercer. Falling hard, falling fast, falling in a way that terrified her. And if she let herself fall all the way, if she gave him everything she had, what happened when it ended? Her father had trusted someone, had believed in someone, and that trust had killed him. Her grandfather had loved her grandmother with everything he had. And when she died, the light went out of his eyes. The light. He followed her within 6 months, unable to exist in a world without her laughter. Love, in Kimberly's experience, was not a fairy tale. It was a risk. The biggest risk of all. and for the first time in 8 years she was genuinely unsure if she was brave enough to take it. Marcus called. 17 times the first day, 23 the second. By the third day the calls slowed, replaced by texts that ranged from apologetic to worried to something that sounded almost like despair. Please talk to me. My mother was wrong. I told her so. I'm not giving up on us. Please, Kimberly, I need to see you. She read every message. She typed responses a dozen times, then deleted them. She went to work and smiled at customers and earned her tips and pretended that everything was fine, even as her heart was quietly breaking. It was Mama Zainab who finally made her see clearly. Kimberly had gone to the Lebanese restaurant on her day off, seeking the comfort of familiar food and familiar faces. She was halfway through a plate of kibbeh when the old woman sat down across from her, uninvited and unapologetic. You look terrible, Mama Zainab said bluntly. Thank you. The rich man, he is the problem, yes? Kimberly set down her fork. There was no point in denying it. Mama Zainab had known her since she was 8 years old when Hassan first brought her here. The woman could read her like a book in her native tongue. His mother doesn't approve of me. Ah. Mama Zainab nodded wisely. And this surprises you? No, but it made me realize something. I'm not equipped for his world. I don't have the right background, the right education, the right anything. And eventually, he's going to wake up and realize that he made a mistake, and I'll be left with nothing except a broken heart and a reminder that I should have known better. The old woman was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took Kimberly's hands in her own, hands that were wrinkled and spotted with age but still strong, still capable. Do you know why I started this restaurant? Mama Zainab asked. Kimberly shook her head. Because I was afraid. The woman's eyes grew distant, lost in memory. I came to this country in 1978 with nothing. No money, no English, no connections, just my husband, my 2 children, and a dream that felt too big for someone like me. Everyone told me I was crazy. My own family said I would fail. But my husband, my Youssef, he looked at me and said, Zainab, fear is a door. You can stand in front of it forever or you can walk through. But you cannot stand there and complain that you never went anywhere. She squeezed Kimberly's hands. Your grandfather was the same. He left everything he knew to come here. He married an Irish woman when people said it would never work. He raised a family in a country that often did not want him. And he died knowing that he had lived, really lived, because he chose love over fear every single time. Kimberly felt tears prick at her eyes. What if it doesn't work out? What if I give him everything and it's not enough? Then you will hurt. And then you will heal. And then you will know that you were brave enough to try. Mama Zainab's voice softened. But what if it does work? What if this man is exactly what he appears to be? Someone who sees you, truly sees you, and chooses you anyway. Will you really let fear steal that from you? The question hung in the air. My mother is afraid for me too, Kimberly admitted. She's been hurt so many times. By my father's death, by the people who abandoned us when we needed help. She told me to be careful, to protect my heart. And your heart, what does it say? Kimberly thought about Marcus. About the way he looked at her like she was the first real thing he'd seen in years. About the stories of his grandfather, the compass in his pocket, the house he couldn't bear to sell because it would mean letting go. About the man who worked 18-hour days because stopping meant feeling, and feeling meant remembering everything he'd lost. My heart says he's worth the risk, she whispered. Then trust your heart. Mama Zainab smiled. It is wiser than your fear. Kimberly left the restaurant at 8:47 p.m., her mind clearer than it had been in days. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to Marcus. Can you meet me? Our place, the bridge. His response came in seconds. I'm on my way. She got there first. The Brooklyn Bridge at night was magical, lights reflecting off the water, the city sprawling on both sides, the sky dark and infinite above. She stood in the spot where he'd first kissed her, where she'd recited poetry to the wind and waited. He appeared 23 minutes later, slightly breathless, still in his work clothes, a $3,000 suit now rumpled from a day of meetings and a sprint across lower Manhattan. Kimberly. Her name on his lips was relief and hope, and something that sounded almost like prayer. "I'm sorry," she said, "for not answering your calls, for running away. I was scared." "Of my mother?" "Of you." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "Of how much I feel for you. Of what happens if I let myself love you and it doesn't work out. My father loved someone and it killed him. My grandfather loved someone, and when she died, he couldn't survive without her. Love, in my experience, is not a happily ever after. It's a risk, the biggest risk there is." Marcus stepped closer but didn't touch her, waiting, giving her space. "I've spent 8 years protecting myself," Kimberly continued. "Building walls, keeping everyone at a safe distance. And then you came along and suddenly all those walls felt like prisons instead of protection, and that terrified me." "What changed?" "I talked to someone who reminded me that fear is a door. You can stand in front of it forever, or you can walk through." She took a breath. "I'm ready to walk through. If you still want me to." Marcus crossed the remaining distance between them and took her face in his hands. His palms were warm, his touch gentle, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart stop. "I went to see my grandfather's house," he said. "Yesterday, for the first time since the funeral." Kimberly waited. "I walked through every room, his library with all his books still on the shelves, his study with his reading glasses still on the desk, his bedroom, where he spent his last months, looking out at the garden he planted 40 years ago." Marcus's voice was thick. "And I realized something. He didn't spend his life building walls, he spent it building bridges. To my grandmother, who he loved for 52 years. To my mother, who he searched for even when everyone told him to give up. To me, a scared kid from a trailer park who didn't believe he was worth anything." He pressed his forehead against hers. "My mother is wrong," he said. "You're not a risk. You're the safest thing I've ever found. Because for the first time in 3 years, I'm not afraid to feel something. I'm not afraid to hope. And I know that my grandfather would have loved you, would have seen exactly what I see. Someone brave enough to do the right thing, even when it costs. Someone who understands loss and hasn't let it make her bitter. Someone who chooses connection over isolation every single time. Your mother will come around. Or she won't. But either way, I'm not giving you up. Not for her. Not for anyone." He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "I love you, Kimberly Chen. I know it's fast, I know it's crazy, but I love you, and I want to build a life with you, if you'll let me." Kimberly felt the tears she'd been holding back finally spill over. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've loved you since you asked please like it was the hardest word in the English language. Since you told me about your grandfather and I saw the real you underneath all the armor. Since that first night in the car when you listened, really listened like what I said mattered." Marcus kissed her then, and it was different from every kiss before. This wasn't the beginning anymore. This was a choice, a commitment, a leap of faith that both of them were taking together, hands clasped, hearts open. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying. "So what happens now?" Kimberly asked, laughing through her tears. "Now," Marcus said, "we figure it out, together, one day at a time." He took her hand, and they stood there on the bridge, watching the city lights dance on the water. Two people from different worlds bound by grief and hope and the stubborn belief that love was worth the risk. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory one last time. "We have on this earth what makes life worth living." And finally, she understood what he meant. 4 months later, Kimberly stood in the doorway of Edward Mercer's library, watching Marcus carefully place a photograph on the mantelpiece. It was her grandfather, Hassan, at maybe 50 years old, standing in front of Mama Zainab's restaurant with a young woman on his arm. Kimberly's mother, before life had hardened her, before grief had etched itself into the corners of her eyes. "Where did you find this?" Kimberly asked, her voice thick with emotion. Mama Zainab had it. Apparently your grandfather used to bring his whole family here for special occasions. She's been holding on to it for 30 years, waiting for the right moment to give it back. Marcus turned to face her. I thought he should be here. With us. With my grandfather. Kimberly crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. The library smelled like old books and wood polish and something indefinably Marcus. Sandalwood, maybe, or just the scent of someone who felt like home. They'd moved into Edward's house 2 weeks ago. Not the penthouse in Manhattan which Marcus had sold for $4, $1 million, after briefly considering keeping it as a pied-à-terre and then admitting that he never wanted to see it again. Not her tiny studio in Queens, which she'd given up without a moment's regret. But here, in this sprawling estate in Connecticut, where every room held memories of the man who had shaped Marcus into who he was. It had been Kimberly's idea. She'd suggested it one night, curled up on her floor while Marcus tried, and failed, to make her radiator stop screaming. Your grandfather's house is empty, she'd said. And you said he spent his whole life building bridges, connecting people. Don't you think he'd want it to be lived in? To be loved in? Marcus had stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. You'd want that? He asked. To live in a house full of his things, his memories, his ghost, really? I'd want to live in a house that has meaning, she replied. I'd want to sleep in a place where someone lived a full life, loved deeply, mattered. Besides, she smiled slightly. My grandfather and your grandfather probably would have been friends. 2 old men who built everything from nothing, who believed in family over fortune. I think they'd be happy, knowing their grandchildren found each other. 2 weeks later, they moved in. Mrs. Mercer, Margaret, as Kimberly had tentatively started calling her, had visited once, 3 weeks after the confrontation in the car. She'd shown up unannounced, standing on the doorstep of Edward's house with a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Kimberly's monthly grocery budget. I owe you an apology, she'd said, the words clearly costing her something. I was wrong. About you, about what my son needs, about everything, really. Kimberly had let her in. They'd shared the wine, talking for hours about things that mattered, about loss, about fear, about the way that mothers sometimes hurt their children in the name of protection. I spent 17 years in a trailer park, Margaret admitted, before Edward found us, and I hated every minute of it. The poverty, the judgment, the constant fear that we wouldn't make it through another month. When Marcus started dating you, all I could see was someone who might drag him back to that world, back to the life I'd escaped. I understand, Kimberly said, and she did. Fear wore many faces. You're nothing like what I expected, Margaret continued. You're real, in a way that most people in my son's life aren't. And I think... She hesitated, unused to vulnerability. I think his grandfather would have approved. Edward always said that character was the only true wealth. And you have character in spades. It wasn't friendship, not yet. But it was a start. Now standing in Edward's library with Hassan's photograph newly placed on the mantel, Kimberly felt something settle in her chest. A sense of rightness, of belonging. I got you something, Marcus said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Kimberly's heart stopped. Marcus, it's not what you think. He opened the box, revealing not a ring but a delicate gold necklace. Hanging from the chain was a pendant, a compass, identical to the one Marcus carried, but smaller, feminine. I had it made, he said. The same jeweler who made my grandfather's. The inscription is different, though. He turned the pendant over, showing her the words engraved on the back. We have on this earth what makes life worth living. Tears spilled down Kimberly's cheeks. It's from your grandfather's favorite poem, Marcus said softly. I wanted you to carry a piece of him with you, the way I carry a piece of mine. It's perfect, she managed. It's absolutely perfect. He clasped the necklace around her neck and she felt the weight of it settle against her collarbone. A reminder, a promise, a bridge between past and present, between the people they'd lost and the future they were building together. I love you, she said. I love you too. He kissed her forehead. Now come on. We're going to be late for dinner. They were meeting her mother, Linda Chen, who had worked 2 jobs for 8 years to keep them afloat after David died, who had never once complained, never once asked for help, never once let her daughter see how much she was struggling. Linda, who had cried when Kimberly told her about Marcus, not tears of joy but tears of fear. Be careful, she'd said. Rich men don't stay with women like us, not in the long run. But Kimberly had convinced her to give him a chance. And tonight at Mama Zainab's restaurant, neutral ground, familiar territory, they were going to prove that some stories didn't end the way you expected. The restaurant was warm and crowded when they arrived. Mama Zainab herself was presiding over the kitchen, shouting orders in Arabic that Kimberly understood perfectly. Ali greeted them at the door with a knowing smile. Your mother is already here, he said. She's been asking a lot of questions about the food. I think she's nervous. Thank you, Kimberly said. For everything. They found Linda at a corner table, looking uncomfortable in her best dress, a floral print she'd bought at Macy's sale 3 years ago and worn exactly 4 times. Her hair was freshly done, her makeup careful, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mom. Kimberly bent to kiss her cheek. You remember Marcus? Of course. Linda's voice was cautious, guarded. Hello, Mrs. Chen. Marcus extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Linda shook it. Thank you for coming. I know this is unconventional. That's one word for it. Kimberly suppressed a wince. Her mother had never been one for diplomacy. They sat, they ordered. The food came, plate after plate of Lebanese meze, enough to feed twice their number. And slowly, gradually, the conversation thawed. Marcus told Linda about his grandfather, about the trailer park, the food stamps, the years of having nothing, about being chosen, adopted, given a name and a future by a man who owed him nothing but gave him everything. We have more in common than you might think, he said. I know what it's like to struggle, to watch your mother work herself to the bone just to keep the lights on, to go to school hungry because there wasn't enough money for breakfast. Linda's expression shifted. Not warmth, not yet, but something like understanding. And what happened to that boy? She asked. The one who knew what it was like to be poor? Did he forget once the money came? I tried to, Marcus admitted. For a while. I threw myself into work, into building an empire, into becoming someone who would never be hungry again, and I lost myself in the process. I became cold, distant, alone. He reached for Kimberly's hand. Your daughter brought me back. She reminded me of who I was before the money, before the title, before any of it. She sees me, really sees me, in a way that no one has since my grandfather died. Linda was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned to Kimberly. You love him. It wasn't a question. I do, Kimberly said. I really do. And he makes you happy? Happier than I've been in 8 years. Linda nodded slowly. Then, unexpectedly, she reached across the table and took Marcus's hand. My husband was a good man, she said, her voice rough with emotion. He loved our family. He worked hard, and he was destroyed by someone he trusted, someone who took advantage of his kindness. Her grip tightened. If you ever hurt my daughter, if you ever betray her trust the way David's partner betrayed his, I will find a way to make you pay. I don't care how much money you have. I don't care how many lawyers you can afford. A mother's revenge is something money can't buy. Understood, Marcus said solemnly. Good. Linda released his hand and picked up her fork. Now let's eat. The lamb looks wonderful. And just like that, the ice was broken. They stayed at Mama Zainab's for 3 hours, talking and laughing and eating until they couldn't move. By the end of the night, Linda was sharing stories about Hassan, stories Kimberly had never heard, about her grandfather as a young man, full of dreams and poetry and a stubbornness that she recognized in herself. When they finally said goodbye on the sidewalk outside, Linda pulled Marcus into an unexpected hug. "Take care of her," she whispered. "She's all I have left." "I will," he promised. "I swear." Kimberly watched them separate, something warm blooming in her chest, her two worlds finally coming together. They drove home in comfortable silence, the city lights fading behind them as they headed north toward Connecticut. Kimberly leaned her head against the window, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked. "My grandfather. How proud he would be right now. He always said that life was about connections, about the bridges you build between yourself and others. And I think we've built some good bridges tonight." Marcus reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "You know," he said, "my grandfather used to tell me that the best investments are the ones that no one else sees coming. The undervalued stocks that everyone else overlooks. The opportunities that seem too small to matter until they change everything." Sounds like good advice. It is, and I've made a lot of good investments in my life. But you— He glanced at her, his eyes soft in the dim light. "You're the best investment I've ever made, the one that changed everything, the one I'll never regret." Kimberly smiled, feeling the compass pendant warm against her skin. "I'd say the return on investment has been pretty spectacular," she agreed, "for both of us." 8 months later, on a Sunday afternoon in early spring, Marcus proposed. They were in the garden at Edward's house, their house now, filled with their memories as well as his. Kimberly was planting roses, her hands covered in dirt, her hair escaping from its ponytail when Marcus knelt down beside her. "What are you doing?" she asked, laughing. "You're going to ruin those pants." "Some things are worth ruining pants for." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, different from the necklace box, unmistakably different, and opened it. The ring was simple, beautiful. A single diamond on a platinum band, nothing ostentatious or flashy, just elegant and real, like everything they'd built together. "Kimberly Chen," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "You saved me. Not just the $50 million, though that was impressive, but everything. You saved me from becoming someone I didn't want to be. You showed me that connection is worth the risk, that love is worth the fear, that the best things in life are the ones you have to be brave enough to reach for." She was crying already. She didn't care. "My grandfather would have loved you," Marcus continued. "And I think he brought us together. I think he's been watching over us this whole time, making sure I didn't mess this up." He took a shaky breath. "Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that I was worth the chance you took?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Of course it did, because Marcus had secretly measured her ring finger while she slept, because he was the kind of man who noticed details, who paid attention, who cared. They kissed in the garden, surrounded by the roses she'd planted and the memories of two grandfathers who had never met, but somehow, impossibly, had given them everything. 3 months later, they were married. The ceremony was at Mama Zainab's restaurant, transformed for the occasion with flowers and candles and the kind of magic that only happened when love was real. Linda walked Kimberly down the makeshift aisle. Margaret, who had become, against all odds, something like a friend, stood beside Marcus as his witness. Kimberly wore her grandmother's pearls and her grandfather's compass around her neck. Marcus wore his grandfather's brass compass in his pocket, the same one he'd carried every day since he was 16. They wrote their own vows. Kimberly recited a line from Mahmud Darwish in Arabic, then translated it for the guests who didn't understand. "On this earth there is what deserves life." Marcus quoted his grandfather. "The best investments are the ones you make with your heart." And when they kissed, everyone cheered. Mama Zainab loudest of all. Now, a year after their wedding, Kimberly stood at the window of their bedroom watching the sun rise over the garden she'd planted. The compass pendant hung at her throat, warm from her skin. Her husband slept behind her, his breathing deep and even, finally at peace. She thought about the napkin, about the risk she'd taken, about a night in November when she'd overheard Arabic businessmen plotting and decided, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, to do the right thing. That one choice had changed everything, had brought her Marcus and Linda's healing and Margaret's unlikely friendship, had brought her this house filled with memories of grandfathers who believed in love, had brought her a life she never could have imagined, built on the foundation of two people who understood loss and chose connection anyway. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from her mother. "Don't forget dinner tonight. I'm making your father's favorite recipe." Kimberly smiled. They had dinner with Linda every Sunday now, a tradition that reminded her of those Sunday afternoons with Hassan, reading poetry on a faded Persian rug. Some things, she realized, never really ended. They just transformed, became something new, became the foundation for everything that came after. Marcus stirred behind her, reaching for her even in his sleep. "Come back to bed," he mumbled. "It's too early." "It's 7:30. "Like I said, too early." She laughed and climbed back under the covers, fitting herself against his warmth. He pulled her close, his arm around her waist, his breath warm against her hair. "I love you," he said, still half asleep. "I love you too." Outside, the sun continued to rise, painting the garden in gold, and Kimberly closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the compass against her heart, and knew that she had finally found what her grandfather always promised she would. Something on this earth that made life worth living.